The room smelled of damp stone and iron. Not the clean iron of a blacksmith's forge, not the bright metallic scent of a newly forged blade, but old iron. The kind of iron that had absorbed decades of sweat and blood and terror into its grain, until the metal itself seemed to exhale human suffering. The kind of iron that you could taste on the back of your tongue when you breathed through your mouth because you did not want to breathe through your nose. Because breathing through your nose meant smelling other things as well, things that were worse. Sir Anthony Kingston stood in the doorway of the dungeon beneath the White Tower and tried to control his breathing. He was 51 years old. He had served the crown for over 2 decades. He had fought in military campaigns. He had watched men die on battlefields where the mud ran red and the screaming did not stop for hours. He had overseen executions where the condemned struggled against their restraints and begged for mercy that was never going to come. He was the Constable of the Tower of London, the man responsible for England's most notorious prison, the man who held the keys to the dungeons where the most dangerous enemies of the crown were kept and questioned and broken. He was not a man who frightened easily. He was not a man who flinched at unpleasant duties. He was a servant of the king, trained to carry out whatever was required without hesitation or complaint. But what he had been ordered to do today was making his hands shake. The rack sat in the center of the chamber like an altar built for a god of cruelty. It was a wooden frame roughly 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, raised slightly off the floor on thick oak legs. At each end, heavy wooden rollers were fitted with iron ratchets and thick hemp ropes. The ropes ended in loops designed to fit around human wrists and human ankles. When the rollers were turned, the ropes pulled in opposite directions, stretching the body laid between them. Slowly at first, then with increasing force, the joints would begin to separate. The ligaments would stretch beyond their natural capacity. The shoulders would begin to dislocate with a sound like wet wood cracking. Then the elbows, then the hips, then the knees, then the ankles. The pain at each stage was beyond description, beyond anything the human nervous system was designed to process, beyond anything that most prisoners could endure for more than a few minutes before they said whatever their torturers wanted to hear. Kingston had seen the rack used before. He had watched prisoners placed upon it, had watched the ropes tighten, had watched bodies stretch and twist, and heard sounds that visited him in his sleep on nights when the wine was not strong enough to keep the memories away. It was his duty. It was the law. The tower had been authorized to use torture when the safety of the realm required information that prisoners would not surrender voluntarily. He did not enjoy it. He did not relish it. But he did his duty. He had always done his duty. Today, his duty was different. Today, the prisoner being brought to this chamber was not a traitor caught plotting against the crown, not a spy intercepted carrying documents to a foreign power, not a rebel who had raised an army against the king's authority. Today, the prisoner was a woman, a young woman, a gentlewoman of good family, the daughter of a knight, educated and articulate and possessed of a quiet courage that Kingston had already witnessed during her interrogations. A woman who had committed no act of violence against anyone. A woman whose only crime was believing that the bread and wine of the Holy Sacrament were bread and wine, symbols of Christ's sacrifice, rather than literally transformed into his flesh and blood by the words of a priest. Her name was Anne Askew. She was 25 years old. And Sir Anthony Kingston had been ordered by the Lord Chancellor of England, Thomas Wriothesley, to put her on the rack and keep her there until she revealed the names of every Protestant sympathizer she knew, particularly any names connected to the household of Queen Catherine Parr. Kingston understood perfectly what was really happening. This was not about religion. This was not about heresy or the salvation of Anne Askew's eternal soul. This was about politics. About a faction at court led by the conservative Bishop Stephen Gardiner and the Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, who wanted to destroy Queen Catherine Parr by proving that her household harbored heretics. Anne Askew was the link. Anne Askew knew names. Anne Askew had connections to ladies in the Queen's inner circle. If Anne could be made to speak those names, the Queen herself might fall. And the Lord Chancellor did not care what it took to make her speak. Kingston heard footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. Multiple footsteps. The guards bringing the prisoner. He straightened his posture and set his jaw. He would do what the law required, and not one turn of the wheel more. He would apply the minimum pressure necessary. He would give her every opportunity to speak before increasing the strain. He would conduct himself as a professional servant of the crown, not as a butcher. This was his resolution, the private bargain he had made with his conscience in the hours since receiving his orders. The door opened wider. 2 guards entered first, then a slight figure between them, walking under her own power, her chin raised, her eyes clear and alert despite the weeks she had already spent in prison. She wore a simple linen shift, the standard garment prisoners were given before being placed on the rack because outer clothing interfered with the mechanism. Her hair, which Kingston remembered as carefully arranged during her earlier examinations, now hung loose around her shoulders, unwashed and tangled. She was thin. The prison diet had stripped flesh from her already small frame, making her look younger than her 25 years. She looked, Kingston thought with a lurch of something he refused to call pity, like someone's daughter. Which she was, Sir William Askew's daughter, a knight's daughter. A gentlewoman born to comfort and education and the quiet life of an English country wife, now standing barefoot on cold stone in a torture chamber beneath the Tower of London because she believed the wrong thing about bread. Anne Askew looked at the rack. She looked at it calmly, the way a person might examine a piece of unfamiliar furniture. She studied the frame, the rollers, the ropes, the iron ratchets. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not collapse or try to flee. She turned her gaze to Kingston and said something that would be recorded in her own writings, smuggled out of prison and published after her death. Words that have survived for nearly 500 years because they captured a moment of extraordinary human courage. She said, "I am not afraid. The Lord is my strength." Kingston felt something shift inside his chest, a feeling he would later describe to the king himself when he raced from the tower to explain what had happened, a feeling that what he was about to do was not duty. It was something else entirely, something that stained a man's soul in ways that could not be washed clean. But before I tell you what happened on that rack, before I describe what they did to Anne Askew's body and what they could not do to her spirit, before I tell you about the moment when the professional torturer refused to continue and the Lord Chancellor of England rolled up his own sleeves and operated the machine with his own hands, before I reveal how this 25-year-old woman was carried to her execution in a chair because the rack had destroyed her ability to walk, and how she was burned alive while sitting because she could no longer stand, I need to take you back. I need to tell you who Anne Askew was. I need to show you the world that created her and the forces that conspired to destroy her. I need to explain why a young woman from a comfortable family in Lincolnshire became the only woman in recorded history to be tortured on the rack in the Tower of London, and why her silence on that rack, her absolute refusal to speak a single name despite pain that would have broken anyone, might be the single greatest act of courage in the entire history of Tudor England. Because Anne Askew's story is not just a story about religious persecution. It is a story about what happens when political power decides that one woman's body can be used as a tool to destroy a queen. It is a story about the lengths to which men will go to break a person who refuses to be broken. It is a story about the machinery of state terror, operated not by faceless bureaucrats, but by the most powerful men in England, men who held the highest offices in the land, men who sat at the king's own table, men who took personal, physical, hands-on pleasure in the destruction of a woman who dared to think for herself. And it is a story about silence. about the power of refusing to speak when every nerve in your body is screaming, and every mechanism of torture that human ingenuity has devised is being applied to your flesh specifically to make you open your mouth and say the names that would save you from further agony. If you want to understand how courage functions under conditions designed to annihilate it, if you want to know what the human body endures on the rack, and what the human spirit can withstand when faith is stronger than pain, if you want to learn about the darkest chapter in the history of the Tower of London and the woman at its center, whose refusal to break may have saved a queen's life, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now, because this story has been buried for nearly 500 years beneath layers of sanitized history that never tells you what really happened in that dungeon. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from, because Anne Askew's courage deserves to be heard in every corner of the world. And make sure you watch all the way to the end, because I am going to describe her execution in detail. The chair they carried her in because she could not walk. The chains they used to bind her to the stake because she could not stand. The bag of gunpowder tied around her neck. And the words she spoke while the flames rose around her that left witnesses, including the young lady Jane Grey, shaken to their core. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to a comfortable home in Lincolnshire, where a young girl was reading a book that would eventually cost her everything. Anne Askew was born in 1521 in the village of Stallingborough, near